Hello, today's episode is about my favorite and my not so favorite Beatle books. Over the years I've read many Beatle books. I think the first I became a Beatle fan when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I guess this must have been my first Beatle book, must have been one of the first books at all that I read as an 8 or 9 year old. So let's start with the ones that I don't like too much, or maybe even dislike, hate, maybe hate. The books by Jeffrey Giuliano. One book at least by him when I was very young, like 10 years old, and even back then I knew that it's more like very gossipy, and the sources aren't that, it's not like it's definitely not the Beatles themselves who are interviewed, and it's not even the close friends or relatives. It's really it's very gossipy. It contains lots of rumors, and it's not really those books aren't really good. Another book that's a dishonorable mention is this book, which is Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald. That when it came out in the 90s, there was like it got praise, and it's still, I think it's very high as one of the favorite Beatle books by many Beatle experts to this day. Unlike Jeffrey Giuliano, Ian MacDonald isn't like, he doesn't have facts, or that he's not honest, or really a bad journalism. He's really a good writer. If you like that sort of style, and he everything seems to be fact checked, and that's my criticism is exactly the opposite to the Giuliano criticism. This is almost an academical book. I didn't read it. I couldn't read it all. I stopped somewhere here. It's too, it's a very snobby book, maybe a bit elitist book. This is more one of those more anti-Paul McCartney kind of books, where Paul McCartney is portrayed as just a lightweight ballad songwriter, and it's not one of my favorites. It's not very objective in that sense. You may expect, talking about that, the infamous, not famous, but infamous Albert Goldman book, John Lennon. This is the German. Some books I have in the German translation, especially those like the old ones that I read when I was very young. When I was like 10 years old. At that time, I couldn't read English books, of course. So some of those I've got in German language. This is the most infamous Beatles book by, like I said, Albert Goldman, John Lennon. This is, of course, regarded an anti-John Lennon book, but I don't have it in my dishonorable mentions. It's not one of my. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites. You can really pretty much see that Goldman is really trying to destroy the Lennon myth, which can be a good thing. John Lennon himself often tried to destroy that myth, but it's sometimes a bit mean, and it comes across like he really wants to put him down. But I like that book because you get some information in that book that is, first of all, there are sources to, some of the things are like his own interpretation, and then it's always like painting John Lennon as a kind of villain, and I don't like that, of course, as a big John Lennon fan. But there are some fact-based things that he found out, and they're very important. Some of my favorite Beatle books, which aren't disputed, which are really held in high regard. I think they really took a lot from this book, from things he researched. Let's talk about one of my favorite Beatle books now, You Never Give Me Your Money by Peter Doggett. I think You Never Give Me Your Money takes a lot from this book, lots of information from this book, and no one seemed to have a problem with the Peter Doggett book. And the Peter Doggett book is a really great book. It's about the time after the split, or it starts around 1968 when things turned sour with the Beatles, and it's a very first of all, it's the style is great because it's a very humorous book, good sense of humor, but also the facts and the detail of all their the relationship the four members had after the breakup. Very great, very good book. And on the same page, I got this book, The Beatles After the Breakup, by Keith Batham. This is also, Peter Doggett also took, I think, Peter Doggett took inspiration from the Goldman book and from this book. Those are maybe his two biggest sources of information. And this is also a great book of the time after the split up, but only until 2000. The Doggett book, I think, is like around 2010 or something. Until then, those were, the books I've talked about now are all pretty well-known Beatle books. Another pretty well-known Beatle book, but for the wrong reasons, another dishonorable mention, the last dishonorable mention is Shout by Philip Norman. That's probably the worst of all the Beatle books. I don't have it anymore. I think I threw it away many years ago. This is really trash. This is very sloppy, and again very anti-McCartney. But it's not bad because it's anti-McCartney, but it's just one of the many flaws of the book. But now, not so famous books that I like. John by Cynthia Lennon. Autobiographies by people who are really around, or not always, but are often very, very good books. This is a great book by Cynthia about her relationship with John, of course. This is a very unknown book. This is a book that no one really talks about. It's by Ella Aronowitz, and it's not just about the Beatles, like the title said, Bob Dylan and the Beatles. Ella Aronowitz was the guy who arranged the first meeting between Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and he was present when the Beatles famously smoked their first joint, and it was him, not Bob Dylan, who gave the joint to the Beatles. And this book is about all the meetings he had with either the Beatles or Dylan, or meetings where they all were together. So it's very, very insightful. It's really, you get really some information that you don't get in any other book, and yeah, that's great. Another autobiography, maybe the best of those books, the best of the books that were written by people who, recount what they experienced themselves with the Beatles. This is Here, There and Everywhere by Geoff Emerick. That's a pro Paul McCartney book. So if the others are anti Paul McCartney, this is maybe too pro Paul McCartney. But on the other hand, he was around. It's not like with Philip Norman that he or Ian MacDonald that he didn't know him personally. He was around, so and he's clearly a big fan of Paul McCartney, not so much of George Harrison. Although it's balanced. He also sometimes he praises George Harrison as well. This is probably the best of those books written by someone from the Beatle camp. Andrew Dixon maybe that was the inspiration for that video, probably because Andrew Dixon made a video like 1 month ago where he said he read somewhere that Tony Barrows, the PR guy for the Beatles, that he just recently found out that he seemed to have problems with George Martin, and that it's the first time he hears something negative about George Martin from someone who was around. And I commented that also, and you can read it in the book, Geoff Emerick himself, he was the assistant to George Martin. He was the one working closest to George Martin. He also had some not so nice things to say, unfortunately, about George Martin. It's always difficult. There's so much personal stuff going on with accounts by people who were there, so you never can really tell if what's the truth, but at least it's very interesting to hear different accounts of events. Another great book, that was the first Beatle book I ever read. That was when I was like 8 or 9 years old, when I became a Beatle fan. That's also why it's in German language. In the original, it's by Mark Herzgart. The original is called A Day in the Life, and this is first and foremost about the recording career of the Beatles. but also, you know, it was good for me to start into it as when I became a fan, because it's also a short, you know, it's not too extensive, at least the version I have. Just a basic retelling of the biography of like what happened 1962, what happened 1963, but the focus is on the music and how it was produced. So a very good book. Then another book that doesn't, you know, get talked enough about, I think, in Beatle fan circles. This is the best, by far best biography on George Harrison. Behind the Locked Door. Great book. It's a bit in the style of You Never Give Me Your Money. It's also kind of funny in places, and it's a, you know, great stories in this book. Then there are books that I borrowed to people and never got back, but I really love. Many years from now, the kind of autobiography by Paul and Barry Miles about Paul McCartney in the 60s. That's you know, I don't really make a top 10 or top 5 ranking here, because some of those books I've read 20 years ago, so it would be a bit silly. I can't really say. It's hard to differentiate which book I like more, but this is definitely, many years from now, it's definitely a top 5 Beatle book to me. This Paul McCartney book, it's not as good as Many Years From Now, but it's like the part 2. It's not by the same author, of course, but it's like a sequel to Many Years From Now, because it's about Paul McCartney in the 70s. Wings, first and foremost. Great Wings biography. The best Wings biography, I would say. This is also a great book. The John Lennon letters. It's letters he wrote or he received from various people, including all the Beatles. So it's great. And this is probably the book most Beatle fans at the moment think is the best. I don't think so. It's, you know, it's not as bad as the Revolution in the Head book, but it's also a bit too academical for me. You know, there's not enough life in it. Of course, Mark Lewison, you know, you have to respect Mark Lewison. He's the #1 Beatle expert in the world, and this is the part 1 of a. It's planned for many years or decades now, a 3-part series. This is up until Love Me Do, I would say, from the beginning. Tune in. I guess the next book will be called Turn On, and the third will be Drop Out. You know, if you're really a Beatle fan, a really Beatle nerd, then you have to have this book, and it's of course a great book. But I don't think it's the best Beatle book. It's not my personal favorite. Not my personal favorite, but this is, I would say, this is the #1 book, especially if you're a beginner, if you're new to the Beatles. This is like the starter kit, the anthology book. It's basically all the interviews for the anthology, even the bits that aren't in the TV documentary. You know, it's them. It's John, Paul, George, and Ringo retelling the story with their words, and it's also with great photos and so on. So for someone who's like a Beatle fan for 1 or 2 years now, and some of the other books, you know, you have to have some kind of knowledge already. But this is like, I would say, this is the first book you should read if you want to know more about the Beatles. Some people say it's a sanitized version of it because it's authorized by them, and you know, there was always like Yoko Ono could we do this and that, and so it's not like the nitty-gritty. But you know, for the nitty-gritty, there are books like the Peter Doggett book, or if you really want the dirty stuff, the Goldman book even. This is maybe sanitized, but I don't have a problem with it. You know, it's like they want to tell the story. You have to keep that in mind. But it's a good book, I would say. And there's a last honorable mention would be the first authorized, or the only authorized. Well, this is also authorized, of course, but the first authorized biography during when the Beatles were together, the Hunter Davies book from 1968. It was also one of the first books I've read on the Beatles. But you know, my copy is I still have the copy, but it's like it's completely torn apart and pages missing, and so you could tell that I own this book for more than 30 years now. But of course, it's also a great book, and yeah, this was like a quick or not so quick summary of the Beatle books from my point of view. Thank you for watching.